Okay, welcome everybody. Hello. So this is the last BBL of the fiscal year for the Global Solution Group, GSG, for value chains and agribusiness. For those, well, I guess if you've all received this invitation and are present, you already know that the GSG is a cross World Bank group of almost 300 staff members who are interested in providing solutions in the agribusiness space. And rather than sort of take up a lot of discussion time, because we have quite an ambitious agenda with introductions, I'll just start maybe by introducing myself, and we'll see a show of hands from across the World Bank group who all is here. My name is Lorraine Ronke. I'm the global lead for value chains and agribusiness. And I sit both in the agriculture GP and in T&C. So how many Aggies do we have? How many Ag GP? Great. And T&C? And IFC? And anybody has joined us from the cross-cutting solution area for PPP? Okay, so we can say, no, I'm just kidding. We will behave. As for most of our, yes, yeah, there's a new terminology I'm sure I'm behind on the. So as for all of our sessions, we are recording this session for the benefit of our colleagues that can't join, either because they're in a different time zone or because this seems like a cruel and unusual punishment to put a BBL in the last 2 days of the fiscal year. But it's not. It's actually a very exciting time to do this because we have, for those of us interested in agribusiness, as all of you are, a really exciting time to be working in this space. As you all will have heard, there's kind of a well-established logic now that is going to be intuitive to a lot of people in this room and a lot of people viewing this BBL recording. But it's great to actually have it embodied in what they're calling the cascade. I wonder if you could go in and bring the... Why I say it's intuitive is that surely through our projects, our discussions, our GSG activities, we've often sort of been de facto following this thought process about how do we discern what the public and private roles should be in our agribusiness operations, in our dialogue with the client, and indeed in those conversations with the client, discussing with them about what they think are the appropriate roles between. And some form of this is the thread running through that discussion, right? It's where's the private sector? If they're not here, why are they not here? Is there something that could be reformed that is in the public arena that could open up these markets or induce them to be here? If that's not enough, are there risk mitigation tools and instruments that are needed to sort of tip the balance on what becomes sort of acceptable risk in return for the private sector? And ultimately, if not, is this where we should be putting scarce public financing? And I have, many of you will have seen on our intranet site or in the Agri newsletter, this sort of existential question that we posted there about anybody who's ever had to face this in their projects, this question about whether to build a packing house or not, certainly has gone through some version of this. And if they haven't, they end up doing that in their review meeting. So we are operating in this kind of cascade world, although many of us here have already been operating there. And the bank is really stepping up its engagement here. You all know that we have the $2.5 billion fund under IDA 18 private sector window, following this same logic, following this same sort of ethos. So it behooved us in the GSG actually to maybe be the ones to start having this discussion in operational terms as well. We have in the World Bank Group a definition that was developed under the leadership of formerly the CCSA for PPP around what a PPP is, what a public-private partnership is. And it's a contractual agreement in which public and private entities each bring in assets or services. And you would find it probably here on this bottom line there. But if you think about this thought process, if you think about, where is the private sector? Why aren't they here in this particular agribusiness subsector? Are there reforms that are in the public sphere that we could be undertaking? The question you're asking is, what's the partnership here between public and private? And so beyond the sort of classic definition of contractual definition, there are a lot of different types of partnerships. I'll just use the English word, so small p, partnerships that the public sector and the private sector can undertake to really move the needle on agribusiness development, inclusive agribusiness development, and all that we know it can develop. And that, my friends, is the impetus for this launch event, where we will start drawing on global experiences, today the Dutch, to see what different models of public-private partnerships have looked like, successes, failures. This is the beginning of a series of discussions. So we're very happy to have our guests here and our discussants. And I'm going to turn the mic over to our colleague, Vinen, who told me not to pronounce his last name. So to maybe introduce, the partnership that you represent and what we're all doing here today. Thank you, Vinen.
All right. Let me move close to the mic, which is here, I think. Yeah. And make it a bit dynamic by walking around. Yes, just very briefly about where I frame this. This was supposed to work. Yeah. It doesn't work from there. Yeah. Can you? What's going wrong? Always good to have support. But yeah, just let me. We have this partnership between the Netherlands and the World Bank Group on food security. I just want to frame this session a little bit in that framework of that partnership. I'm not going to bore you with explaining a lot about the partnership. Of course, you all know, you're all very familiar with it. But it boils down to basically two main things, and that is looking for synergies between what the bank does and knows, and the things that the Netherlands knows and does, and see how we can support each other, how we can make our programs stronger, the implementation programs. So that is one. It's basically knowledge-based, and the other one is to mention is to look for scale and for impact, and that is particularly true when you talk about bilateral experiences, and how can you, and maybe by collaborating with the World Bank, scale these experiences. But and we're also not going to bore you with all the stuff that's going on in terms of matchmaking, bringing partners together, or looking for where the bank and the bilateral programs of the Netherlands can work better together. But there were two strategic questions that were articulated by Ethel Sennhauser as director of the Agriculture Global Practice that she would hope that the partnership would help with. And one is to help in the move in the thinking from agriculture production to food system thinking, and the second is to show more examples of how in our facilities and instruments in the Netherlands we put the private sector more upfront in trying to get sector transformation going in various countries in public-private partnerships, because there was a feeling that maybe the bank acts sometimes still too hands-on through the government and the public sector. So as you can see from the announcement of this presentation, clearly this presentation fits into that second strategic question. So just a few markers around it. I think Lorraine didn't mention it yet, but we engaged with the Global Solution Group in really trying to make this a learning agenda, so it's not a one-off BBL. You've probably seen already in the newsletter of the AgGP that there are sort of best practice cases published every week for a couple of weeks, which will soon end. But even, and anyway, those examples are there. We have this presentation today, and together with the Global Solution Group, we are ready, if there's demand, to further expand this into a learning agenda. IDA 18 Cascade and private sector window, I think Lorraine already framed that. It is also interesting to look at how how you approach, and that relates also to the strategic question, how you approach things more from the top to the bottom, whether the bank lends major amounts and engages with the government in policy discussions on policies and regulations, or how do you create a groundswell of private sector initiatives in countries that work from the bottom up towards the enabling environment that is required to further promote this in our client countries. So that is maybe a somewhat distinguishing approach, but maybe it's also not entirely distinguishing, because very often you need this vertically integrated approach where you take it all. What's the nature of public good? Is also in this case, I think, interesting. If you look at the cross-cutting solution area, it's very often taken as large investments in infrastructure, the road, the bridge, the hospital, the irrigation scheme. But in our perspective and our understanding of public good is also the rural development, rural poverty, rural skills levels and stuff like that. So you can look at different ways at what is the nature of a public good. And then PPP facilities, public-private partnerships, is one thing, and that is really trying to get public sector goals and private sector goals aligned and working together to achieve both of them. And that's a little bit, it's not the same as matching grants, because very often people think, oh, that's a matching grant scheme. Matching grants is an instrument, and of course it's very often used in public-private partnerships to get this further. But these two things are not the same. Anyway, the bank is quite familiar with matching grant schemes. Even there's been a recent review, and this is the last slide, which I took a photograph of because I was not able to electronically get it from the report. So apologies. But it's interesting. It was an interesting picture because you see the number of approved matching grants in 5-year periods, and you see agriculture mentioned there separately. And whoops, what happened in the last 5-year period? It drops down to nearly nothing. So the report doesn't explain it very well, but we have to maybe consider and think what has happened. And well, that is part of the discussion today. So on the blue upper one, you see a lot of investment matching grant schemes in small and medium enterprise development, but that's partially different from what we discussed today. So with that, rest me to introduce Jan as the next speaker, Jan Uwels, who will give the keynote. And Jan works with SNV, the Netherlands Development Organization, very, very powerful organization in many developing countries, gone pretty local in terms of everything and its staffing and so on. Doing great work, working a lot with the World Bank as well. Jan is a strategic advisor at SNV, has been working a lot in developing country, Western Africa, Egypt, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and where not, with consultancies, firms, academia. And his specialization includes especially institutional and capacity development and multi-actor processes and public-private partnerships. And he speaks from the perspective of a PPP lab, which is a learning facility in the Netherlands on public-private partnerships, which groups together many experiences. Jan. We have to get to the other presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm not a regular visitor of the bank, I must say. Let me talk with this one. Yeah. Thanks. I'm not a regular visitor of the bank, I must say. So I'm really bringing to you experiences from another environment. But Jean, for example, knows some of it, some of the thinking behind it in the Netherlands. because we have, over the last 5 years, tried to be more serious about public-private partnerships. And of course, that's all because of these questions about how private sector dynamics and also finance can be leveraged for the difficult things that we're facing in the agriculture sector for the next few years. In terms of inclusion, in terms of food production, basically, simply, and in terms, of course, of the environmental dimensions of water and energy connected to agriculture. Let me get into all the... Like Wijnand says, I'm talking here especially from an initiative that's called PPP Lab, which has been started by 2 universities and 2 Dutch NGOs that were all interested in these questions. We look at PPPs in food and in water. In water, they're much more conventional. In food and in agriculture, they're much more new. We designed a couple of roles for ourselves. I just want to mention the 3 big themes that we're looking at. We're looking at scaling and system change, how these PPPs are used for that. We're also looking particularly at the public P. There's been lots of work recently on the private sector side of these things. We're looking more at the public side. How does this serve the public goods, and how does it also engage the public sector? I'll come back to that. And we're looking at all kinds of financing strategies. Though on that level, I'll be fairly simple. It's not my specialization, I must admit. I'll say something more around scaling and system change and how that relates to public goods. And again, do that on a very kind of experience-based practitioner level. I'm not a scientist. I'm a guy that has tried to do agriculture development in a range of places. Our website has a whole range of documents. I'll pull some of the work, especially from this one, a recent piece we did on scaling. And we also build tools for practitioners. This is an example. Some of you may know the business model canvas that is used by inclusive business exercises. Osterwalder has created that. We made a version that especially was extended to be useful for PPPs rather than for businesses, by adding those 4 blocks. I won't talk more about it, but if you're interested in these kinds of tools, there's something on our site. This is what I'll try to cover for you in 5 blocks. And as we've started late, I'll not spend words on it, but just start doing it. Lorraine, I think, said already that lots of this PPP thinking, also in your bank, I have a few contacts there, is in infrastructure and basic services delivery. I just want to say upfront, this is a different ballgame. And it costed us some effort in the Netherlands also to make clear that we were opening up an idea of PPPs that didn't fit in the models that were existing. And that's the course that we're charting. And that's why I found it so interesting to talk to you from the agriculture sector. But our argument in the Netherlands is these are PPPs for 2 major reasons. There is joint action needed for some form of other form of delivery, other form of system, other form of market. And there's principles of joint investment and joint risks, which is essentially at the bottom of PPPs and makes them different from service or management contracts. Again, I'll try to keep a bit of pace because I want to get to a couple of examples from our Dutch portfolio. But here's that portfolio itself. These are 5 Dutch instruments that have been created over the last 4 years, basically. This one is especially on agriculture. This is on water, but has also irrigation, water irrigated agriculture in it, and basin management. This one is on the use of geodata for both agriculture and water. This one is on agribusiness clusters in Africa, very local. And this one is a specific window in Ghana. The embassy there decided to open up a window according to the logics that we're developing from the center in the Dutch. There's amounts here and there's numbers of projects. You can see there's more than 350 or in the order of 350 million euros into those windows just now. Several of these windows are still having calls again. That's just the public element. That means that there are 700 million in total in this package. I know you guys are sometimes signing individual deals of that size, but we in the Netherlands find this already very significant. And at least we learn a lot from it. Before I go to the Dutch kind of basic model around PPPs, I wanted to use this chart, which is comes from the inclusive business and the impact investment sphere. It's been made by Monitor and Deloitte, who talk about scaling barriers. And they discern these 4 spheres. One around the enterprise itself and its business case and business model. One around the value chain around that product. But a third one is what they call public goods, and a fourth one is the government itself. What they call public goods, by the way, and that's an interesting discussion that was raised already, is not just the infrastructure or the conventional definitions of public goods. This figure has been developed on the basis of agricultural initiatives in impact investment. They argue that, for example, the general education level, skills, awareness of certain solutions and whatever could be considered as a public good because they are, in a way, the enabling environment. They're determining whether things happen or not. And individual firms trying to move a sector or a business somewhere often don't have the lever to make that environment start to resonate more widely with what they're after. That's why some of the firms, big ones and small ones, are so interested in public partnerships. I'll get a couple of examples around that. The Dutch diamond, that is a term that has been coined a few years ago for a perspective on PPPs that is not just having business and government, but is having civil society, knowledge institutes and financiers in these partnerships. And I'll give very concrete examples of it. And we have started to learn that Jean, you called it fairly typically Dutch because we have such a tightly knit agricultural sector also. We have seen that adding these to the business government kind of collaboration does add a lot of change power to the PPPs. And I'll come back to that in the examples. In that Dutch, let's say, experimentation with PPPs over the last few years, we have played with PPPs in very different domains within agriculture. And I've just put a picture here with the regular agriculture value chain from farmer to consumer. And we basically see PPPs in 4 different domains. There are some with firms that are focusing on selling stuff to farmers or providing services. That could even be finance, but it is also, let's say, 2-wheel tractors, small greenhouses for relatively local people, all kinds of things that you sell to farmers. On the other hand, here we have, and I'll add the small elements to it, we have what we've labeled here as improved supply. Local agribusiness and producers organizations that buy from farmers. Very different economic dynamics, very different scaling dimensions of these PPPs. We also have bigger value chain programs, often led by processors or traders at a higher level. And we have them in a whole range of different commodities. And finally, there is a small group of programs that we're focusing on food products for people, enriched stuff, etc. That is not growing rapidly because the Dutch government has decided to pursue that in other ways through other forms of finance. Just to give you a picture of the range of different types of PPPs within the agriculture sector. Now I come to 3 cases that I'd love to share with you. And the first one is this one in India. And again, I'll not tell you all the details, and each of these three are complex stories. So I can't honor them really in what they're trying to do, but I'll try to sketch you a couple of big parameters. Sugar in India, we're talking about a small margin business with huge amounts of over-extraction of groundwater, which is really putting its sustainability at serious risk. There are alternatives available in the world, but the transition is not easy. That's the basic starting point. What we see here is a PPP that was actually initiated by an NGO called Solidaridad. They know a lot of the sugar business. They have specialized in that. They do have a strategic relationship with Unilever in the Netherlands and have the Hindustan Unilever Foundation in India in this PPP with money. They also got, as their main private partners, 3 sugar mills. Indian sugar mills that put money into this Dutch PPP. They pay significant amounts in the total volume of, because the total volume is almost 5 million, and only half of that comes from the Dutch ministry. There's another tech firm, and there's local research institutes connected to it. Basically, what the PPP tries to do is to use that technology is already known as basically drip irrigation, that kind of stuff. It has never been used well in those command areas for sugar in India. They develop a proof of concept with those 3 mills to show that it works and that it is an attractive proposition financially at all levels. There's business cases for farmers, there's business cases for the mills, and there's business cases for the service providers that provide that equipment and whatever. You see some indication of the figures, of the amount of things that people that they have reached, and this is set to work. For those 3 mills, it's a very interesting proposition. They also, one of these firms owns more mills, want to spend it up. But the thing for the consortium is that they want to have a bigger discussion in India around the sustainability of, first, the sugar industry and sugar growing, but secondly also other crops. And so they use the thing very deliberately together with that research institute and the Hindustan Unilever Foundation to bring up a much bigger conversation. Establishing a sugar platform in southern India first and moving on that. So the Dutch PPP, in a sense, serves that bigger agenda of a sector transformation there. One example. A second example. A very different one. This program is called To Scale. It's a program. And in a sense, it's a facility in itself that has been tendered out, you could say. It's not tendered, it has been allocated to an external party. In this case, that is IFDC, the International Fertilizer Development Center, with its headquarters in Geneva, but with a lot of activity on the ground in Africa. They have got a total deal with the Dutch ministry of 45 million. By the end of 2016, they spent 32.5, and he had leveraged 47.5 in terms of private contributions. Now you see again a consortium. In this case, a consortium that doesn't, in the facility, of course, doesn't have the private sector operating the facility itself. There's rather knowledge centers connected to it, but there are 52 partnerships that have now come out of that facility, and they are all led by local entrepreneurs. Dairy entrepreneurs, a soy chain in Benin, all kinds of examples. Here you see numbers again. They have reached 500,000 farmers, more than 1,000 SMEs, and almost 1,500 producer organizations. And next to the 47.5 million, they raised another more than 50 million in terms of credits to all these initiatives. The special thing of this initiative is that it's again a matching grant kind of facility. They give sub-grants to all those 50 partnerships. The partners will have to come with their own contributions. That's all done against DCED, Donor Enterprise Development Committee norms in terms of measuring the additionality, so that firms don't put in money that they would spend anyhow. The interesting thing is that they put facilitators on those local initiatives that build multi-actor partnerships directly. So different from what I read in some of your World Bank documents with matching grants that either go to a single producer organization or to a single processor or SME. Here there's deliberately funding a network, a small ecology of actors. And they work very hard on creating that difference in relationships there. They are now documenting it. There is a draft evaluation coming out right now. It's been on the table this week, in which they also try to show that they are, in many cases, lowering margins actually, because they say we're often operating in monopolistic markets where the margins of the entrepreneurs are relatively high and the amount of people they reach, either on the buying side or on the selling side, is relatively low. Their argument is they are increasing the efficiency of the market by helping to make shifts in the deals between producers, organizations, SMEs, vendors, and whatever. So, hugely interesting because different from the earlier example, this is one that relates very much to relatively local, what they call agri-business clusters. And they facilitate the effectiveness and efficiency of those clusters. And they work with lead, what they call inclusive agribusiness champions. They really select very carefully whom they work with. These could be producer organizations, these could also be SMEs. But they also always work with them in small networks. They also start to create a theory about how they shift the market relationships and what kind of work they do. I mean, that's of course partially simply negotiating work and whatever, but they start to realize that they do four main things for that. They influence the way that partners do decision making with each other and with the actors around them, their suppliers or their buyers. They look at the alignment of inclusive business model and they select the inclusive business models that they want to support. They look at embedding these models in the larger partnerships and in the public domain and do advocacy for them. And they develop for such a specific subsector an own intervention repertoire that they try to make more replicable. There's a nice example on soy in Benin. People get protein in many cases from fish and from all kinds of small animals and from frozen chicken dumped by the EU. That last pattern is shifting. One of their nice stories, one of those 52, is that they have created a soy value chain in southern Benin around the urban centers, where they have not just created the production of soy with small farmers, but also the vending of new soy products. We talk about soy cheese and soy kebab to poor people in Cotonou and around. And it is a flourishing business by now, and it's tending to be growing and producing a protein-rich food for relatively poor people. A third case, very different again. And this case I bring because it's unique in the fact that two big firms, and we talk about Nestle and Nespresso, those are really big firms, have put money in what is basically a public task, integrated water resources management. And they have invested around 7 million themselves from their sources in something that doesn't produce a direct return for them. It's an indirect return. And why do they do it? Because they are already feeling the effect of climate change. Coffee production per acre in some areas of Colombia has gone down as much as 30%. Because of either too much rain or too little rain, and combinations of that. This is a very special PPP. It's possibly the largest that have been done through these windows, with these two big firms and the Colombian Federation of Coffee Growers, two local ministries, and Wageningen University in the key consortium. And actually Wageningen was the initiator of it, but the leader now is the National Coffee Association. I didn't manage, because I didn't see it, but I saw it this morning, to put in much more precise results that they booked. In those 5 departments, and with all those coffee growing family, they have really trained 75,000 farmers. They have done huge stuff. They have started thousands of how do you call that? Anaerobic treatment plants for where the coffee is clean. Those are huge sources of pollution for the rivers. But they have also, like I said, trained 75,000 and are now growing an enormous amounts of plans for better water management practice on farm. They are in the thousands now of individual farms that shift their practices at the farm level, and at the same time they're working with the local departments to do real catchment area level work. There are river basin plans for 25 river basins, for example. One of the interesting things I feel of this is that it's clearly an investment, a co-investment in the public domain. Of course, they will, on the long run, reap the benefits of this. So they're very strategic with their money. But they are co-investing in, and we've not seen that before, co-investing in a public task. And it also, the way that it's done with a range of platforms in those departments and at the national level, e-learning communities, by the way, with lots of those farmers participating in it, a website, all kind of stuff, gives a picture of what an enabling environment can be, different from the kind of technocratic definition of, if we're making enabling environment, we're going to improve the rules for food safety or something. This is a living enabling environment that starts to emerge. 3 examples. How am I with my time? How much have I left, Lorraine? 5? Let me try. Scaling and system change. Buzzword scaling the last few years. When we started to search for it on the internet, we found that there was very little good literature. There's simply no theories almost around scaling. There's lots of small bits and pieces. One helpful model now has been to distinguish between horizontal and vertical. And horizontal is mostly what businesses do, try to simply, through a business case and a business model, create larger numbers. But mass media, for example, if we talk about behavioral change media for maternal care or something, is also horizontal. Vertical is moving into the system, moving into organizations and the rules of the game, the enabling environment. It's interesting to look at the 3 examples. Basically, what To Scale is doing is creating new niches here. And they admit they're not yet moving upwards, but they're creating viable new dynamics. And in their next stage, they're having big questions about how they can create, that soy example, a bigger kind of expansion of those kinds of practices to other places in the country or even to other countries. The sugar India case is another one where you see that they try to make the case and show it works in India. They're pretty sure it works, but you have to show it there. And then we'll move to what is called the rules of the game or the institutional level for that subsector at the next stage. In Colombia, you actually see that they move very quick. They know what is needed here. They have moved here to create an enabling environment that will induce all kinds of practices with those farmers. We felt that in the conversation around scaling, initially in the Netherlands, it was all very much from the business case model and just showing its power as something economically or financially attractive. While that in itself often doesn't work, because you have to embed those new practices. This is another figure. The word regime is maybe not so, because regime change has other connotations, I realized yesterday. But that's what the people that created this figure used. You come from a niche, and then you have to try to embed it in a larger system. And often, in India, for example, there's big, what they call landscape factors. In India, the petrol for groundwater pumping and the pumps themselves are heavily subsidized. And that is a big kind of given for farmers in India who will not easily sacrifice that. But if you don't shift that, you're promoting very detrimental practices in terms of groundwater use. So now these even the farmers from those areas and these 3 mills are starting to build up a lobby for shifting some of that ballgame, which is really coming from outside the sugar subsector. Another example around scaling that we noticed had the same kind of thing. This is from one of the other projects in our portfolios. Farm Access promotes health services and health insurance for poor people in Africa. I can't treat that case here, very interesting as well, but they said introduce and prove the viability of a new paradigm in a small ecosystem, expand and embed new paradigm in a bigger ecosystem, and achieve shift to new paradigm at national ecosystem. And we see PPPs that we fund from the Netherlands operate in both these 2 steps. And we have questions, I'll get that on that for the next, at another level about in which stage you would be. Another question that we asked to these PPPs, to a large number of them, and to a couple of 15 thought leaders that we interviewed about scaling, is what do you do? What do you do when you scale? We use that word very easily. And we got, at the end, to a very rich picture of 10 things. And I don't have the time. I see Lorraine looking at me. There's technology. There's the business cases. There's awareness and demand. There's financing. There's value chain development. There's coordination platforms in many of these cases. There's public sector governance. There's lobby and advocacy, building a kind of change coalition. There's knowledge and education, in many cases very important, to back up innovations by the general knowledge. That's why there are Indian research institutes in that sugar thing. And there's often also data and ICT. Lots of clever use of data and ICT in these cases, ranging from drones for agriculture monitoring to availability of data to small farmers in the Colombia case. We have developed those 10 in another picture as this kind of set of ingredients. And we notice that people like it because they use it as a way of screening their own scaling strategy and say, hey, where am I strong? Where am I weak? What things have I thought about? And many people come from specific angles. Businesses will normally come from this sphere. Public will come from that sphere. The technical people will come from that sphere, and the NGO people will come from that sphere. So a bit of an underpinning also of the thinking behind that Dutch diamond, that you often need different kinds of people to build a strong case and new perspective, new practice. That is an example of how Farm Access, again, the same organization I mentioned just now, used it to scan 2 of their projects. I don't say it should always look like this. These are simply 2 different projects. But they used it to scan and see, hey, how are our balances and do we find that appropriate? This one was actually fairly appropriate for that case. Final content thing on scaling and system change. What we noticed with the PPPs was that people in the agency that manages most of those windows in the Netherlands come from an enterprise subsidy kind of window sphere. Export subsidies, risks, whatever. They were thinking at the individual business level and thinking about where such an organization was in terms of scaling its own business proposition. They were looking at the individual business case and whatever of that firm. We added another layer of stages, completely different layer of stages. They look like they fit together because they're both four, but they don't fit. This is about sector transformation. This comes from Lucas Simons from New Foresight and Scope Insight, an organization that I know also works for you sometimes, Jean. And they say, how does system change actually happen? How does sector transformation happen in agriculture chain? They work mainly in agricultural chains. And they've sketched these 3 stages of inception where there's all kinds of new ideas. Then you get a kind of clustering of new ideas on how it should be done better. You saw that, for example, in all that certification of agriculture products. You got competing certificates also, labels. In many cases, these people are indeed competing at that stage. And then at a certain stage, one starts to see not the pre-competitive, but the beyond competitive, I would call it. Where they know that they need to tackle a couple of things that are in the public good sphere and are bigger than each of their own initiatives. And only if that happens, the government can easily come in and help to scale things further. We found that an interesting model, also because when we discussed with the people at our ministry guiding these instruments, they realized they were often investing at this, rather at the transition from 1 to 2, because they, of course, they wanted a bit of a proof that something was viable to invest in. And they were less on this side of the second. And they're now considering that they should actually be more deliberate on being on this side. So you can make a nice evaluation of that business case, but if you don't know where the bigger process in that sector is, you're making very bad judgments about whether it will be a success or not, and how scaling must be pursued. So that is another logic that we added to the picture. Has to do again with those scaling barriers. I won't go into that. I've basically said what I wanted to say with this sheet already. You have to consider not only the upper figure, but also the basic figure, the below figure. I have 4 concluding perspectives. Our conclusion is it's not easy. I'm showing you the good examples. There are quite a bit of difficult examples that hadn't been thought through well enough. But these kinds of cases, and we have more of them that are really good, show that PPPs can be incubators and boosters for innovation and for shifting markets, shifting system dynamics in those markets. And yes, they help to create a more practice-based groundswell where things have been tested and start to influence the norms and values and regulations rather than that regulations are prescribed from above because that is the international standard or something. They often have new models for service delivery and knowledge transfer built into them that can be scaled in themselves. And there are indications, though we can't prove it in terms of evaluation yet, that indeed many of these PPPs do have important impact in terms of both effectiveness of development measures and the efficiency of markets. But that has to be studied better. And the weak cases will probably not have that. In our Dutch history with these new things, it came from our aid and trade agenda. It was, as it were, opening up for the private sector. There was a lot of focus on the business case side of it. Does this private sector that now is going to work with public sector domain as well have sufficient thorough business cases? The tide is switching a bit in the Netherlands. One is starting to realize that there is as much a question in how are the public good strategies of these things? How is that vertical scaling moving? But there is a general acknowledgement that NGOs and knowledge institutes, also, by the way, from the private sector itself, play vital roles there in getting that public good dimension right. The actual engagement of public P has been a bit of a challenge and difficulty, especially because the Dutch government wanted to have the local public P, let's say the local ministries of agriculture, as a partner into those PPPs. Many of the businesses shied away from that. But by the way, many of the public entities also shied away from that. Imagine a local district commissioner signing a legal deal with an agency in the Netherlands. That doesn't work. So that is how we have started to shy away a bit from having local public Ps as formal partners in many of these projects, but rather as strategic partners for them. And sometimes financing partners still, but not as implementing partner. Final lesson there's a lot of operational lessons. Some of these instruments have been made far too complex. There must be better analysis of the competitive playing field than was done in the first generations of these instruments. And by the way, also the position of the lead firm, and to what degree it has monopolistic tendencies or not, to what degree it wants to work with that beyond competition kind of sphere. The choice and nature of the executing agency is a major thing. And a big element that comes out is the importance of the management of those partnerships or of the facilitation of those partnerships. Many of the firms hire external managers or facilitators for those partnerships. From those four, a very final thing that is, for us in the Netherlands, there were two mind shifts in this over the last few years. One, of course, is the basic one behind that Dutch diamond, that often you can probably help change to happen or incubators for change to happen better if you work with the various partners engaged with an issue than in those individual lines. This one was another one that emerged only over the last few years and has to do with that effect on the public good. We thought about those things as leveraging private sector money for public goods in principle very much, and simply in amounts of numbers of people achieved. We're now starting to see that the numbers is nice, but the question of whether you're really deliberately working on market or system transformation at certain elements is, in a sense, more important. So that is my final conclusion. We have a set of learning agenda issues as PPP Lab for the coming 2 years again. I won't bother you with that, but if there's any interest at some stage in joining up on some of these learning themes, we would be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unless you're feeling that you didn't get to say everything you wanted to say, I just want to tell you you're not off the hook yet. We structured this session so as to pause here and invite our two discussants and the group, which is assembled, to guide the rest of the discussion about what was mentioned, but perhaps you wanted to know more about questions, which will lead into our final 5 minutes of this session about where we should take these discussions as part of the GSG sponsored events in partnership. Yes? So let's do that. I want to just revert to the opening objective for this BBL and indeed for this discussion series, which was to explore together staff from the different GPs and IFC and cross-cutting solution areas or whatever they're called, who are interested in inclusive agribusiness development, to explore what kinds of partnerships could we start deploying. At what point in our sort of cascade mentality are some more appropriate than others? And so we thought it was important, and we're quite grateful to Julian Lampetti to have somebody who manages a portfolio of those operations and activities to serve as discussant. Julian is a practice manager in the agriculture GP for MENA and Eastern Central Asia. ECA. Yeah, but you know, they always tell you don't use that. So, Eastern Europe, that's what I meant. Eastern Europe. What did I say? Eastern. Really? Okay, no, not that. Now, we also mentioned, a big part actually of the banks, the World Bank Group's movement in this direction has to do with the large PSW private sector window um, in under IDA 18, and a good chunk of that is blended finance. So when you backstop or blend these public funds with private sector investment, and really the institutional knowledge on blended finance in agriculture, in agribusiness, rests with the GASP private sector window. And so we're very lucky to have Neeraj Shah here, who is the acting head for the Global Agriculture Food Security Program. Did I get it right? It's not Asia. It's GASP private sector window. Can be in Asia. Neeraj. So I would invite you maybe to take 4 or 5 minutes each to sort of with reference to the objective of exploring this space, what you think is most relevant from your respective perspectives. Julian, did you want to start?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Lorraine, and thanks for a great presentation. So first thing I want to say is I think this is super timely. This is great. We are way, way, way behind most of our colleagues in the bank in our thinking about this and how to get involved in the cascade, how to bring the private sector in. And it's ironic because I think in a sense we are probably the largest private sector that there is out there. If you think about agriculture and the whole agri-food complex, I don't have the numbers, but I'm guessing globally that is probably the largest private sector out there. Not in terms of volume, but in terms of sort of numbers of businesses, especially if you start thinking about every farm as a business. So the idea of how do you leverage private finance, private capital into this largest private sector, and the fact that almost the entire emphasis of our institution right now is on large infrastructure is perplexing to me. And I think we need to change this because we can bring a lot to the table here. And it's quite different for IFC, but in the bank, the entire dialogue around this is really on big infrastructure. I think there's two pieces to doing that. One is that we need to start thinking very, very carefully how we define sort of public goods and private goods. And, the textbook definition of a public good is pretty easy to wrap your head around. I think it's non-excludable and non-divisible, right? Now, there's almost nothing that actually fits in those two categories except air, maybe, right? And national defense. Those are the two classic, right? So a lot of the rest of the stuff we talk about is actually not a pure public good, right? It's a spectrum. And, depending on where you are on that spectrum, there's different sets of arguments about how you want to bring in the public sector versus the private sector to supply those things. And, we tend to sort of mix that up. And I think one really useful thing for us would be to have a typology of how far along the scale you're going. What are the spillover effects, right? So is rural development a public good at the end of the day? We could spend a long time debating that, but the spillover effects of doing good rural development on your nutrition or whatever, so I think part of our fundamental challenge is we haven't defined the space we're operating in very clearly. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think, especially when you have to deal with lead economists in the bank who are going to challenge you every single step of the way here, having that space well defined and thought through, I think is key. The second area that I think we need to start thinking really creatively is on the instruments we use. We are pretty limited at the end of the day on the bank side in terms of the 5 or 6 instruments we use. And there's a whole huge range of things we could be doing out there that I think would be really, really interesting. And I want to give you 2 examples of things that I came across recently in my travels that are the kinds of things I would like to be doing. And once I give you those 2 examples, we can figure out maybe how we can actually work on those things together. So I was in Georgia a couple weeks ago, the Republic of Georgia, not the state here in the U.S., and the minister came to me and he said, look, Julian, I want to borrow $50 million to improve the mechanization in my country. Basically, you buy a bunch of tractors. And, I was thinking about this, I worked in ECA 15 years ago and we gave the guy a $50 million loan to buy a bunch of tractors. And he said, well, yeah, we maintained those tractors for 15 years, but now they're done. And so we started talking and I said to him, well, why don't you do something like contact Uber and John Deere and get John Deere to basically finance the tractors, Uber to manage the tractors. They'll make a ton of money, and you provide a guarantee instrument of some sort, maybe to get their capital out or something on the exchange rate risk. And that's the role we play, is we help you design that deal so that Uber and John Deere will come in and finance the whole mechanization. And instead of putting $50 million into this, we'll put $5 million, right, to back these investors to come in. Now, you have to think about exactly what kind of risk they're worried about and everything, but that would essentially be a way for him to achieve the same thing with a much lower involvement from our side. And the fundamental challenge we have is we don't have the resources to really design the first set of deals like that. So the other example I wanted to give you is in Tunisia. So the Tunisians are very interested in doing microcredit, and I happen to know through some contacts of mine, some people who want to finance microcredit, right? They have a fund that does invest in microcredit, which is a pretty popular thing to do now. So I was talking to these guys and I was like, well, instead of us financing a microcredit fund, there's all this private capital. There's $8 billion of private capital looking for somewhere to go in agriculture today, right? That was the number they were throwing around at the Agri Invest conference we were at. So why can't we actually set up a system? The government could hire a developer to have an app that would allow people to access microcredit on their phones, and you could have investors come in and capitalize that. And again, the World Bank Group could provide an instrument that would help guarantee certain parts of the risk to encourage them to do this, right? So I've referred to two sets of guarantees around different kinds of instruments, but my sense is that's the space we really need to be thinking of. And we need to be pushing our ministries of agricultures and our clients into putting a lot more data out there so that you can get a lot more private investment in using that data, okay, across our countries. So the last point I wanted to make was, so the biggest challenge I face in this business in terms of managing my team and my unit is it's very, very hard to find the resources to think through these ideas in a systematic way with our clients. And maybe that's an area where we can work with the PPP lab, choose a couple of ideas that they're very keen on, this Uberization of tractors in Georgia, and actually do a study together as a partnership to try to help them.
Okay, thank you very much. Niraj, a few thoughts?
Thanks. It's a good time to be here. We have our GAFSP Private Sector Window Donor Committee meetings next week. And the Dutch are one of, actually the largest donor to the private sector window. I think I want to talk about what I think is a wonderful example of a PPP. It's a example that Jean is well aware of. Many of you have seen. It's our project in Rwanda. And for me, that epitomizes what we should be able to see in a lot more projects, but we really don't. And a lot of things fell into place for that to happen. So we have a Dutch sponsor called DSM, which is a nutraceutical company. And it's an investor into, along with the government of Rwanda, into a processing plant which would manufacture fortified soy and corn products to be sold to the World Food Program and to the government of Rwanda to treat malnutrition. So that is the typical classic process. The project that IFC would be very interested in financing, except that the financial returns and risks returns are too low and the risks are very high. So that's where Blended Finance came in. GAFSP partnered with IFC, and not just IFC and GAFSP. We even had FMO coming in. and then CDC came in. So there's a whole bunch of international DFIs which have come in, and we agreed that we would put equity as well as debt into that plant. So that's the first thing. Then you realize that the plant's capacity is massive, and you're going to try and source soy and maize from the local supply chains, but there's not enough capacity to supply the plant. So you need to then make sure that the capacity of the farmers and the value chain is increased. So you have to train them, and then you need to provide access to finance to those farmers. So you went and then spoke to the banks in Rwanda to say, can we offer a line of credit to the bank to then on lend to those farmers to then increase their production of crops to then supply this plant. So it's all taken, I think the final approval came after 2 years of planning. And then this is the second year that the plant has been up and running. And of course, there are a bunch of challenges there. But it's an interesting thing that we've managed to sort of get the entire cycle going. And then there was a GAFSP public sector window project in Rwanda at the same time, which was on hillside irrigation, working with the government and the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture to try and improve the ecosystem in the same areas that this project was based. So in a happy coincidence, both the windows of the GAFSP happen to work together on that. It doesn't happen very often. It's one of the biggest criticisms that we've faced. That we just haven't been able to find opportunities where both the windows, in spite of operating in many countries which are common to both, haven't been able to do something together. And I'm really looking for solutions and suggestions to do a better job of that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Jan, for the presentation where you really did expand, as was the objective of the BBL, really expand the notion of what partnerships between public and private sector can be, as well as some of the lessons from the Dutch experience around scaling. Julian, you're speaking to us about sort of the desirability to have a better definition of the space and the sort of topology or the range, the spectrum of public goods, as well as the limitation of our instruments, but also of the innovation in our activities and in the portfolio, what's possible and when. And Neeraj, thanks very much for bringing up the Rwanda example, because although serendipity did have a big role, I think many of the people seated here could imagine different scenarios between either their trade and competitiveness or agriculture work and the challenges of matching that up with private sector. And I know actually several people that have a very intimate knowledge of those challenges. So I would like to open it up to this group of people to discuss, ask on any of the panel's observations that they've shared with you today, and that we would dedicate the time remaining to that, from which Vinan and I will try to glean where your interests are and maybe communicate a kind of learning program going forward. So over to you. Yes, can you say your name and then whatever question? Brad, go for it. Yeah.
Hello. So my name is Brad Roberts. I work with the Trade and Competitiveness Unit, but I came recently from the IFC working with Neeraj. And I want to get back maybe to Jan, one of your the cases you highlighted, and I think Neeraj already touched on a bigger, you could say, challenge we have within the World Bank Group and more broadly PPPs is this P, the public side. I noted two of your cases. I think I didn't necessarily see a public sector entity involved. It was only in the third case you had the local the ministries involved. And I think for us, it's always we have similar projects where we, on the IFC side, where we do similar type PPP work, but we're limited by that scale where we don't have public sector involved in this for two reasons. One, how can you reach scale? You view a public mechanism to reach more beyond just maybe one geographical area, but others where policy and regulations can tip the scales positively or negatively on any project. A subsidy comes in, a regulation comes in that undermines your project. So to me, I think the challenge is how do we get the public, the big P, into these projects more actively, World Bank Group representing that and working with the P, with IFC, into these relationships, getting the fear beyond both the private sector and the public sector out of working together. I don't know how you did it. It'd be interesting to know how you were able to do it in Colombia, and how can we get that more openness and that way to collaborate, a part of doing business as opposed to the, like we say in the Rwanda case, more of it was serendipity that it came together. It wasn't strategic.
Thanks, Dwayne. Chris Jackson from the Agriculture GP. I wanted to ask a question of any of the panel, I guess, about the political space that exists in our clients for engaging in these kind of relationships. It's a very contemporary feature, even in Western governments, to resource public funds to any kind of private sector entity, whether it's, in the UK, the Public Finance Initiative was only 15 years old or so. And that comes at a time when there is a recognition that it is legitimate for public sector to provide subsidies and resources to the private sector, but it doesn't always work. It often fails, but there's a sophisticated understanding that that's okay. In many of our clients, any finance minister or minister of agriculture who would engage in this would get banged up in jail for causing a financial loss to the state. And there are examples where this has happened. So I wonder, given that most of our clients on the either side are governments, what can we do to help encourage and foster the political space where they feel comfortable as political leaders to make these resource allocation decisions, and that it's acceptable within those societies more generally that this is an appropriate use of funding, and create the space for failure without necessarily those such draconian sanctions forthcoming? Because I think that's a very difficult challenge for us to get these kind of approaches adopted by our clients.
Do we have anybody who has joined remotely that wants to provide a question? Biden, I don't know if they're through email or the chat, or if you want to unmute at this point and put forward a question. Otherwise, we will take these. Okay, yeah, Will, why don't you provide us with a third, and then we're going to turn back to the panel.
Yeah, thanks. So just a quick reflection and on Julian's great example of the Uber and John Deere example. What I've seen in IFC in the infrastructure sector is quite a good instrument to kind of tackle these early stage project kind of development ideas is through the infra ventures kind of mechanism, which basically uses a mix of kind of IFC and donor funding to take on projects that are not yet at a kind of fully financially viable stage, and IFC takes an equity stake in that. And if the project then reaches a stage where it's possible to financially close that, then IFC is able to kind of take some profit out of that. So essentially buys into the upside that can come through in these with these opportunities. So maybe, I mean, for you, but also maybe for Niraj to reflect on whether that kind of a concept could be possible in the agriculture sector. I mean, it's essentially the model that AgDevCo takes, but I've never really seen them be able to kind of scale it. They seem to still be relatively small in the countries in which they operate. So I know it's difficult, maybe in agribusiness, and particularly I know they focus on greenfield agribusiness, but maybe as a mechanism to try to, for IFC and the World Bank, to try to innovate in some of those kind of areas that you referred to, it could be an interesting idea. Thanks.
Jan, to take the first couple on what in the Dutch experience, how did you do it in Colombia, having an appropriate sort of public sector role? And also there was Chris's question about the political space, which I would also turn to Julian if he had something to say.
Yeah, thanks, Lorraine. Let me not go to the political space question directly, because it's a very difficult one. And the Colombia case at the end, this Coffee Federation FNC was the vital player, and I mean it's a unique setup in a sense. I don't know another country where a commodity-based farmers organization is as well organized and strong as this Coffee Federation in Colombia. They are almost like a parastatal. If one of you is European and has seen the Tour de France, those Colombian cyclists there are sponsored by these people. So that is quite an entity, FNC there. Café de Colombia, it has on the top. And I think through them, the ministries came on board and saw that with them and with this money, there could be something possible that they had actually not been able to do well, this integrated water resource management at the catchment level. So they now have multiple sources for arranging that. And of course, there's a question, because there's big Dutch money in it that is not there to stay. But they see apparently ways of developing this connection between coffee sector and the government to fund this. That is an easy one. I want to make a small hop to Julian's example. I find it a nice example because I see there's one water example that has just been funded in one of these windows in the Netherlands, where we see a similarly innovative model around maintenance of water pumps in the Sahel region. We really talk about dispersed pumps in villages with ICT devices on a GPS and whatever, with a service contract. A completely new delivery and service model that this French firm is going to experiment with a couple of NGOs from the Netherlands. And it looks in a way like your solution for the tractors. It brings a completely different dynamic to how you would run what is considered to be public hardware or whatever. Back to the political space question. To be honest, I don't have an answer because I'm not in that space with you guys on how you negotiate with the governments or whatever. So anything I say about this is very superficial. The only thought I have, look, there are quite a number of governments that have central PPP facilities. I recently talked to a guy from the Philippines one, for example. But they are all dealing with airports, harbors, the big stuff. They're not into this ball game that we're discussing just now. The only thing I can see is like with the example I just mentioned about the water pump maintenance that has some similarities with your tractor idea. I could imagine that part of your funding could simply be incubator funds, matching grants for these kind of incubating projects. The experience in those projects is, however, don't get the operating agency of that government too close to it too soon. Give more space and let the government be a kind of protector of that space and a strategic ally in creating that space, but not co-manage every individual project. Most firms and most NGOs would see that as almost killing the initiative of trying to make an innovation. And I must say, I talked to local people, government, both at the national and the local level in Kenya on a sanitation innovation project, who happily said afterwards, we were actually quite happy that we were not engaged because we wouldn't have had a clue at the start. And so have them engaged, but let certain things get more mature, as it were, and then picked up by them. They're happy to pick up good ideas, and they have much more trouble in being together in uncertain ideas, most governments. So that is my superficial answer at a very basic level from where because I'm never in the kind of ball games that you are in terms of negotiating the big things. Reinhard.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that political space because it's a very good question and also very critical question to ask. But I think the thing is that some of these governments will have to go through the same process and thinking and development that has happened elsewhere on that and that you refer to already. And that is in the sense of explaining and making clear also with examples like we've been doing here today, that a Dutch diamond can also be a Uganda diamond, and that can actually work for them in terms of achieving their own political and development goals. And then you get to the question: is the World Bank ready to engage on that kind of processes and discussions with the local government? Because if SDC from Switzerland or DGIS from the Netherlands does it, it's something different than when the World Bank engages with the government on this kind of discussion. So that is one. And the second point there is, what do you actually finance? And so what you see mostly in the examples that we give is that you finance with public money the public role in the public-private partnership, and that is different from, for example, financing equipment for an SME in order to get an investment going. So it's also about for what purpose do you use public sector money in those kind of facilities, and do you really fund the public sector role in that? So.
Julian, did you want to add something on that political space as well as maybe respond to Will in his?
Sure. So on the political space, it cuts like both ways, right? Because there are people that are, afraid of getting into deals because they'll be thrown in prison, but there's also, ironically, deals that obviously get pushed that they should be thrown in prison for, right? And you could end up in these whole situations where you're on the corner of something that's actually, really fishy. And so, it all depends on your appetite for risk, but I think it cuts both ways, right? And so you have to really be focused on changing the development mindset. And frankly, I'm sure this is much less of a problem in IFC, but in the bank, the mindset of the TTLs is still, more bigger loans, right? And so they don't necessarily go into the space of thinking, how can I reduce the size of my loan and do something different? And I would venture to say that, I don't think that's going to change with $75 billion of IDA that's going to go through certain regions in the next few years. But it might change in the regions where they don't access that money and you have very little IBRD funding and you have to come up with very creative ideas on how to do things. And so, not a pitch for my own regions, but I think there's a clear incentive to go to the certain regions where you're not going to be flooded with money that you're trying to push out the door in terms of coming up with these ideas. So on the bank side, we do have an instrument similar to the one you described, with the name of which I don't remember, which is the GIF, right? The Global Infrastructure Facility, right? Where you actually come in and you try to help them with the design stage so that they can create a deal and then you get that money back. You don't typically take an equity stake, but that instrument is designed entirely for big infrastructure. If you look at the bylaws, I mean, I know Helen Martin quite well. I've been lobbying with her, but it just doesn't fit. And so you'd have to rewrite the whole thing. So we should come up with an instrument to cook these kinds of things, right? I mean, the possibilities are endless. As I said, this is a huge sector, right? And the kinds of things we can do with technology and data in agriculture and the digital revolution in agriculture are just phenomenal. So let's get behind that. Let's figure out how to get some money so we can design some really interesting things. And I think it's a total game changer if we can figure out how to do it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Maybe just to wrap up, I want to put Neeraj on the spot, exactly, to answer this question, and perhaps also as a follow-on, to have a session where you share some of the hits and misses, in addition to Rwanda, from the GAFSP private sector window experience. I think that would really spark off ideas in WBG speak. In our contexts. So I've kind of volunteered you for that. I hope that's okay. But if you want to respond, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. And thanks for raising that one. One of the most fascinating things about the GAFSP private sector window is that the donors gave us a lot of flexibility. And I think we're grateful for that. So as of today, we have 51 projects which got approved. Half of them are actually directly into agribusiness companies, but at least half are through financial institutions, microfinance. So we've got equity, we've got debt, we've got quasi-equity, we've got first losses, you name it. We've had a real run over the last 5 years designing some really funky structures. It's all been good. We've got so just coming back to the point, I think Infra Ventures, I'm not sure if it has donor funding. I thought that was all IFC money. Or was that SME Ventures?
It is,
okay.
IFC money, but it's not
Exactly.
with the IFC return. It's patient capital.
So it's IFC money, which is at risk, which is different from what we have. So we're actually a little more flexible there. We can actually put an equity in early stage companies or greenfield ventures, which is where the biggest amount of risk and the biggest amount of fear for IFC credit officers and managers lies. And that's been the tricky part. Of course, if you have a 10-year horizon, that's the sort of stuff we should be doing. And maybe one of the things that we will be thinking of as we're looking at the second phase of GAFSP is to do more risky equities. The challenge is the way the blended finance model works is you have to have an equal amount from IFC. And that's usually that's where, even if the donors are willing to put more money at risk, the IFC money is then also equally at risk, and therefore you also have a responsibility to try and make sure that money is coming back to IFC. So it's been that's been really the tricky part. But blended finance has a lot of lessons for us. We've got a lot of projects which have which have done well. We don't have a single NPL as of today. That situation will change over the next 1 or 2 years as some of these projects start maturing. But yeah, happy to talk about it.
Great. Yes, you can have one sentence.
Just to add, Niraj, that in the next stage of thinking in the Dutch, because this was all grant-based, that whole blended finance question is coming up seriously. Also from the people that have received some of these grants, because they say, listen, we want to move forward, and we don't need necessarily a grant anymore, but how do we deal? So very interesting conversation, I think, also for us.
Right, because I mean, the partnership that Vinan is stewarding for us here is supposed to be two-way, and I think it could be quite a useful conversation, perhaps, for you from the WBG experience. I want to thank everybody for attending. This is the first of this kind, but we would like to continue on this theme. So please do drop us a line through the GSG website about where you think some of the priority topics you'd like to explore further. And this message is also to the people who are viewing this remotely. So thanks very much to everybody. Enjoy the break that comes at the end of the fiscal year, right? Right? And we'll see you in the new year. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panel.
Thank you.